Good morning, YouTube! Before we start today, I'd like everybody to sing happy birthday to Casper, who is 101 years old in dog years today. He is a 101 Dalmatian, which coincidentally is the number of subscribers we now have on this channel. So thank you to you, and I'm glad you're enjoying these videos. Today it is brakes. The front brakes on this car are not too bad. The previous owner fitted these refurbished calipers a few years ago, so they're generally in pretty good condition. However, one of the boots has been split while fitting them, so we're going to take this caliper off and strip it down and replace that. Also, the main thing I want to do is replace these original rubber hoses. These are the original rubber hoses that were fitted to the car, so they're now 22 years old. Now, you wouldn't trust a 20-year-old rubber on your dick, so you shouldn't really trust it under your right foot, so we're going to take these off and replace them with new ones. So we'll deal with the caliper first. Now, the way the brakes work is that when you put your foot on the brake pedal, you pressurise the brake fluid in this hose, which acts on the back of a hydraulic piston inside there. That forces the piston outwards, pushing the inner brake pad against the inside of the brake disc just there. As the brake pad is forced against the brake disc, that causes the caliper to slide in that direction, and it slides on two pins underneath those covers just there and one at the bottom just there. As the caliper slides across, it drags the outer brake pad against the outside of the brake disc, and that's how the pads nip the brake disc to stop the car. Now, I've knocked the pads back a bit so you can see how this works. Normally the pads would start a lot closer to the brake disc than this. Musical accompaniment there from Little Mix with OMG, a personal favourite of mine. Now, if your brakes are binding, or they're pulling to one side, or they just lack feel, they just feel very dead, the reason is almost certainly because of corrosion either on the piston or on those sliders is preventing the caliper moving freely. Now, in this case, the only problem is that one of these rubber boots that protects those sliding surfaces has been split, so we're going to strip the caliper down in order to replace that. The first thing we need to do is to remove the pads. The first thing we need to do is remove the brake pads from the caliper, and for that you're going to want a 6mm diameter punch. If you haven't got a 6mm diameter punch, then a 6mm diameter bolt will do at a pinch. To remove the pads, we just drive the pins out from the inside to the out using that pad pin punch. Now, they're likely to be very tight in there just because of the elements getting all over them and just the heat from the brakes, so you may need to put a bit of heat from a blowtorch onto either end of these, but in this case they're not too bad. So just the only trick here is keeping out of the way of the camera, and then just drive it out. And then do the same at the bottom. Then note which way the springs were fitted and remove those. Then force the piston back into the caliper. Now, if the piston's a bit tight, you'll probably have to get a lever, like a crowbar on that, in order to get yourself enough leverage. But when the piston's slid back a bit, you can just slide your old pad out. Then slide the caliper across. Give yourself some clearance to get the outer one out, and again, if your sliders are corroding, you may need to whack that with a mallet to do that, but this one's obviously fine, and then just slide your outer pad out. If you just need to replace the sliders, you can do that without disconnecting the flexible hose from the caliper, and that'll save you having to bleed the brakes at the end. If you need to replace the piston because it's stuck in the caliper, then you'll have to remove the caliper from the car and disconnect the flexible hose. But before you disconnect the flexible hose, get an assistant to pump the brake pedal a few times to shove the piston out as far as you can. Don't push it all the way out because you get brake fluid pouring everywhere, but shove it almost all the way out. The reason for that is that when you've got the caliper on the bench, if the piston is stuck in the caliper, it can be a right battle to remove. So if you do most of the job with the hydraulic force from the brake pedal, that'll make life a lot easier for you. To remove the caliper, knock the covers off the sliders with a hammer and chisel. There's two of those, one at the top and one at the bottom. Then get a brake hose clamp and clamp it to the flexible hose, and that will prevent you losing all your brake fluid when we undo the hose. Then undo the hose with an 11mm socket. And brake fluid is very effective paint stripper, so protect your paintwork and mop up any spillage from the caliper. The caliper mounting bolts are underneath those two slider covers we just removed, and they are undone with a 10mm Allen key. So withdraw the second bolt and remove the caliper to the bench. If you want to rebuild this caliper, then get parts for a 1985 to 1989 vintage Vauxhall Astra 2-litre GTE 8-valve, because that used a very similar Delco caliper to your Elan. So all the service parts for the caliper, brake discs, brake pads, pad pins and so on, they're all directly interchangeable with your Elan. I've used this company for my brake parts for the last few years. I find them very good, and they hold stock of all the parts that you need to rebuild this caliper. However, before going to the trouble of rebuilding this caliper, think about whether it's really worth your time and trouble, because a complete set of pistons, seals, sliders and a bleed nipple for this caliper will cost you just over £40. Now that is about the same cost as a complete refurbished caliper on exchange, so you may want to just save yourself the trouble and just swap this out for a refurbished one. If you do that, make sure you get an Elan caliper though. The one thing that is different between this and the Astra is the caliper body itself is very slightly different. What you're looking for if you're replacing the entire caliper is what Brake Engineering's part number CA2008 for the left caliper and CA2008R for the right caliper, or just cross-reference that part number at your local motor factors. But if you do want to rebuild the caliper, then it's pretty straightforward. This rubber boot on the slider has a metal insert in, and you prise the whole lot off as an assembly with the slider. So you just get a small screwdriver in around the back and lever this cap off. You can withdraw the slider, the seal and the rubber boot. When you go to put the new one back in, the only grease you should use on there is that special rubber friendly brake grease that comes with the rebuild kit, the red stuff that looks like jelly. Don't use regular chassis grease in there, it won't stand the heat, it's likely to attack the rubber of the seal, and certainly don't use copper grease. And to remove the piston, the dust boot has a little sort of metal insert in it there, so just get a hammer and a drift and knock that out of the caliper and gently pry that out and then slip it off out of its groove on the piston itself. And to remove the piston itself, stuff a rag in there to cushion the blow, and then just apply a compressed air line to the fluid inlet. Ooh. Then inspect the bore and the piston for scores, scratches and corrosion. Pry out the old seal and replace it. The new one is lubricated just with brake fluid, and then just reassemble it the opposite of how you took it apart. The dust boot is lubricated with the special rubber grease. And the final hurdle is the bleed nipple. If it's stuck, heat from a blowtorch is the key to success there, but this one's a doddle. When you go to refit the caliper, push the slider through so the metal part of the bush is slightly proud of the surface of the rubber boot. That way, when you put the caliper up to the mountings, there's no danger of whacking the rubber boot into the hub and splitting it, or trapping it underneath the bolts, which is what happened when this one was originally fitted. And then reinsert your bolts and torque those up to 100 Newton meters. The workshop manual recommends that you Loctite the bolts. Then, when your bolts are tightened up, put your protective cap back on. Then refit your pads. Push the piston back into the caliper bore all the way if it isn't already. Your pads may come with one of these anti-squeal shims on the back already. If not, spread a bit of copper grease on the back there to reduce the chance of it squealing, and insert the inner pad. The minimum brake lining thickness for the pads is 2mm. The disc is nominally 24mm thick and the wear limit is 22mm. However, these discs are only £15, about $25 each new, so if there's any wear or scoring or scratching on it, just replace it. So put the inner pad in. Then pull the caliper all the way across and insert the outer pad. The pad springs are assembled so that the short ears are on the outsides, and then the correct roll pins are 92mm long, and they're inserted from the outside towards the in. Now, the problem isn't so much getting them in as getting them out again in a few years' time, so make sure you use plenty of copper grease on the ends of the pins where they go into the caliper. Then, you've got it lined up, just get your pad pin punch and drive them in. Then to insert the second one, just hold the spring down while you push the pin through. So the last thing is to replace these flexible hoses. Now if you watched a few of these videos you'll know that I'm very keen on originality and like to reuse original parts wherever possible. However, even I stopped short of trying to reuse 22-year-old safety critical perish rubber items, so we're going to replace these hoses throughout. Now the original style rubber hoses are still available, but instead I'm going to replace these with these braided steel hoses made by Hell Performance. I've been using these since my racing days and like them so much that I've used nothing else since. In fact, if anyone from Hell Performance is watching, I have spent hundreds of pounds on your brake lines over the years, so it's about time you boys sent me a free t-shirt or something, or I am going to Goodrich next time. But seriously, the advantages of these are that, as the name suggests, the flexible hose is surrounded by a braided steel liner, and that limits the amount that the hose can swell when you're under high braking forces. Now, if you don't use your brakes very hard, then don't bother with these. They'll be a waste of money because they're no different at low braking forces. But when you're really standing on the brakes, they give you a much more linear braking response, a much firmer pedal feel at high braking forces. Also, they dramatically reduce brake fade if you're using the vehicle on a track. So give them a try. When you disconnect your solid line from the flexible brake line, all your brake fluid will try and pour out, but the brake fluid can only come out if air can get in. So if you stretch a piece of cling film over the mouth of the brake fluid reservoir here and then screw the cap down on top of that, that'll stop the air getting in and stop the brake fluid coming out, or at least limit the amount of brake fluid that you lose. And the only tricky bit is getting the union between the solid line and the flexible line undone. Now this clip just pulls out this with a pair of pliers. Now you could leave it in while you're doing this, but it's just in the way of the video, so I'm going to take that out. Now you want an 11mm spanner on that nut there on the flexible line, and a 19mm spanner on that nut underneath the mounting bracket there. However, be careful with this, because this pipe is hollow. If you lean on this, it's likely to be quite tight if it's been on there for a few years. If you lean on this heavily, because the pipe's hollow and it's really weak, you're very likely to crack the solid hose there. So get a bit of penetrating oil on it, then give it a really good scrub down with a wire brush. Then I'd say before you even try and undo it, get a blowtorch on it for about 30 seconds to get some heat into it, and put a heat shield around the back to protect the paint on your chassis. And then when you've got it nice and hot, then just be really careful not to crack that pipe. This is a right nuisance to fit a new one. And there you go, it will come eventually. And then get your new hose ready, because we are going to spill a bit of brake fluid. And undo the old fitting. Right, and then withdraw the original hose. The whole thing just pulls through the bracket on the chassis. Get your new hose and shove that through, and then just reattach them. I said then just reattach them. And then tighten the union to the equivalent of about 10 Newton meters, which obviously you're doing it with a spanner, so you're going to have to guess, but it's firm really rather than tight. And then work quickly to get the other end of the hose connected to the brake caliper. Then at the other end, it's a new copper washer under the head of the bolt, then put that through the banjo fitting, then another copper washer on the outside, and then screw that to the caliper. And the torque that you do these up to depends on what fitting you're using. For these stainless steel fittings on these braided hoses, they're torqued up to 30 Newton meters, but the original mild steel ones are torqued to 40 Newton meters. So all that remains then is to bleed the air out of the lines. So we've got a bleed hose on the nipple with its other end submerged in some brake fluid, and we've got Helper Kate in the driver's seat. Poor old long-suffering Helper Kate who knows the routine. What I'm going to do is open the nipple half a turn, and then on the command of stroke, Helper Kate will push the pedal to the floor and she'll hold it there until I close the nipple. And then I'll say, give Kate the command, pump! Whereupon Kate will pump the pedal a few times until it doesn't get any firmer. Then she'll stop, and then I'll open the bleed nipple again and give Kate the command, stroke! And then I'll give her the command, pump! And we'll just keep carrying on doing that until we get no more air bubbles coming out of the tube. Stroke! There you go, that'll do us. How's that feeling, Helper Kate?
Not bad, pretty firm.
Job's a good one. So all that remains is to hand it over to the boss for technical inspection.